The price of a barrel of oil could impact the final look at where the state stands with that fiscal cliff. Now, I talked to numbers with an LSU professor, and he gave me a lesson about the modern day oil industry and why it should not be confused with the industry of the past. Oil and gas in Louisiana. We live and die by it. Is it a scapegoat, though? Do we use it as an excuse if the price is too low to say, oh, that's the reason we're in financial problems?
So I think to understand what's going on in oil and gas markets in Louisiana right now, you really have to look structurally what's happened over the past decade. And if you look 10 years ago in 2008, for instance, in the United States, we were producing a little less than 5 million barrels of oil a day. At that time, the price was almost $100 a barrel. Today, 10 years later, the price today is about $70, but over the beginning of this year, it's ranged from $60 to $65, something in that range. And we're producing more than 10 million barrels a day. That's twice the oil for a third less of the price. And the reason why we're able to do that is because of fundamental technological innovations that have occurred in the oil and natural gas extraction sectors.
So the oil industry, as it was, is different now because of technology.
It's almost not an exaggeration to say that everything we knew about oil and gas markets 10 years ago today is fundamentally different.
The price of oil and the impacts on Louisiana can be felt in the long term and the short term, but what does that mean exactly?
Historically, oil and gas revenues, direct revenues from severance taxes and royalties that the state receives for drilling that happens on state lands, has been a significant source of revenues for the state. So if you look back to the 1980s, in the early 1980s, literally over 40% of the state's budget directly was associated with oil and gas revenues. But if you look today in the current budget, it's about 5%. And so again, there's been this really fundamental structural shift. In the 1980s, when we had the oil price crash, it was very draconian for the state's budget. But if you look today, the oil price drop, certainly it impacted the state's budget and certainly it impacted the state's economy. But it just was not the same story as it was in the 1980s for the simple reason that the magnitude of the revenues just was not even comparable.
And yet you will still hear people say, oh, well, that's why we're having problems. What do you tell the legislature if you're talking to them right now?
I say that oil and gas revenues can for sure fluctuate whenever there's changes in the prices, but this is something that we've dealt with for decades. And ask people this from a personal finance perspective. Today, oil and gas revenues make up somewhere between 4 and 5% of the state's what we call tax licenses and fees. They're revenues that they collect from the citizens of the state. If you add a 1 or 2 or 3% fluctuation in your income next year, would you be going in and filing for bankruptcy? Well, if that's the case, then you're probably not a very good steward of your resources and you're not managing your finances appropriately.
For every dollar that a barrel of oil goes up, what does that mean for Louisiana's coffers?
In terms of the direct revenues, the estimates you hear floating out there is for every dollar of sustained price increase in oil prices, that leads to about $12 million of revenues directly to the state. Of course, that changes over time. My estimates personally, today it's probably more about the $10 million range. But I think that there are other sort of indirect channels that we need to consider. First of all, whenever the oil price goes up, you and I go to the gas pump and we pump our gas and we're paying more for gasoline. And so that's also going to impact our spending on other goods and services because we have less disposable income. But on the other hand, you have the oil and gas workers who are working in that field, who are earning income. And if the price fluctuates by a lot, especially, you can have large layoffs in those sectors, or you can have increases in employment. And that, of course, is also going to impact income taxes and sales taxes as well. So in order to get a direct or a very specific number, I think there are a lot of things involved. But certainly it has an impact. The Revenue Estimating Conference is scheduled to meet again next week and update their estimate. The current price of oil is about $70 a barrel if you look at what's trading today. But the official forecast for oil that the previous estimate is based on, which is just from a month ago, is about $57 a barrel. And so one might argue, well, they should increase the official forecast. And if you did the math on that, you could get to $150 million in forecasted revenues. That being said, I don't think it would be prudent for the REC to do that. There have been a few big geopolitical changes over the past month, in particular the Iran deal, and that's caused upward pressure on prices. And so to base the forecast for the entire next year based upon this rally we've had over the past month, I think would be a little bit dangerous looking forward to the upcoming year.
Knowing fluctuations can happen.
That's correct.
All right, thanks so much.
Absolutely, thanks for having me.